Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to a special edition of the Human Risk podcast. It's special because I'm releasing it just a few days after recording it as an extra episode between the normal schedule. Now that usually only happens when I've recorded an episode about something topical that's in the news. But in this case, I'm exploring a long-standing human risk dynamic, ethics, and in particular, how that applies in a business context. The reason I'm rushing this episode out is personal, not because I'm having to resolve lots of ethical issues in my business, though, as you'll hear, we all have to deal with them on an ongoing basis, and if you think you don't, watch out. But rather, because of the huge number of times I've found myself talking about the issues shared by my guest since I recorded with her. Now, it's not unusual for me to think about applying what I've learned from my guests on the show in the work that I do with my clients. After all, there's a reason I've invited them on in the first place. But in this case, the insights provided by Professor Josephine Nelson have come up in so many discussions in such a short period that I want to get the episode out ASAP. In part, so the clients I've already spoken to about them, and those I undoubtedly will, can hear it directly from her. But also, because I think it's going to be highly relevant to all of you. Josephine, who publishes as J.S. Nelson, is a professor of business ethics at Villanova Law School and is currently a visiting professor at Harvard Business School. She's the co-author of a brand new book called Business Ethics: What Everyone Needs to Know. It's a practical guide to thinking about and solving ethical issues that we're highly likely to come across in some form in work contexts. Josephine's insights in the book and on the show aren't just relevant to our work environments. They can also help us to think about the decisions made by companies we engage with or choose not to, politicians we vote for, don't, and those with whom we surround ourselves or choose not to. What you're about to hear are some very simple observations about ethics. But don't let the simplicity fool you. They're astonishingly insightful and practical. I can't recommend the book enough, and I'm really excited to bring you this episode because what Josephine has to say is incredibly important. And if you think that means an overly serious episode, think again. As you'll discover, Josephine is a lot of fun and there is lots of laughter. So please enjoy this very special episode of the Human Risk podcast with Professor Josephine Nelson on business ethics. Josephine, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thank you, Christian. I am so delighted to be here, and I'm just delighted to get to talk to you again. Thank you.
I am so thrilled that you're here. Now, technically, this is your second appearance on the show, but it's your first proper appearance because last time it was a crosscast for Alison Taylor and Jerome Tager's podcast, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes. And you were talking there about surveillance, and that's kind of how I first came to know you. Can you talk a little bit about your area of research? How do we get from surveillance into talking about ethics?
Actually, it went the other way around, which is so interesting because as we're talking about ethics and we're talking about that relationship between managers and the people that they're managing, that relationship is absolutely changing with technology. And so that's how I got into the surveillance piece of it. But in thinking about ethics more generally, so the book that's out now is Business Ethics: What Everyone Needs to Know. And the next book is actually on the workplace surveillance stuff. So I'll come back. If I'm invited, Christian, I'll come back and we'll talk surveillance more.
You are totally invited. Okay, so let's dive into this topic of ethics because it's a word that everybody understands intuitively. And we sort of know that we ought to be ethical. But you've had to write a book on it, which suggests that the things we think we know might not necessarily be as obvious in practice. Can you talk a little bit? Why does it matter? And why do we need a book on it? Isn't it obvious?
Well, so this is, as we were mentioning before, this is the great paradox of ethics, that they're both simultaneously intuitive and counterintuitive. So what's great about the landscape of ethics, and I send this out to people to give them hope, is that by and large, across almost every culture, we seem to agree on some fundamental values. We think about fairness, we think about equality, we think about integrity, we think about these other pieces, respect, dignity, and how we would want to be treated. So reciprocity concerns. Now, does that mean that behavior is uniform? Oh no, because every once in a while you'll get these people who say, oh, it's all just based on the Ten Commandments or some other thing that they imagine is uniform. But actually, in many cultures, you have to kill. It's an honor killing. And in other cultures, you may not kill for any reason. But if you talk to people about why they are doing whatever they are doing, the reasoning behind it, it goes down to these core values. So the values themselves are very uniform. The behavior out of them, the cultural part of how they manifest may be very different. But I say this is hopeful for many reasons. One, because we tend to have very similar values, just as human beings across all kinds of cultures, which means that if you can speak the language of values, you can resonate in a lot of places and deeply in a lot of ways. Now, why is this both intuitive and counterintuitive? It's intuitive because we all seem to feel those same values, and that makes sense. And we often know what we're supposed to do. The counterintuitive part is, why don't we do it? Right? We know what we're supposed to do, and we have uniform agreement on the values when we speak values. Why do we not actually do what it is that we know we would do and that we're asked in advance about what we would do? So there's the conundrum. And that's where an enormous amount of the research has been over the last, as we were talking about, 10, 15, 20 years, in really thinking about why it is that we may have this very strong and fairly uniform ethical reaction to things, but we are not doing what we say that we should be doing when we're asked in the abstract. There's something about the context and the situation which means that we act differently. But that also, and again, I'm saying this is a hopeful message, but that also means that ethics can be managed. That if you can change the context and change the situation, you change the behavior.
So to put it really, really simply, because this is ingrained in us on some level, we know what we're trying to get towards. We know the outcomes that we're looking for. And so we've just got some, let's be polite, derailers on the way. There's sort of factors that influence us perhaps to do things that are not in line with that, but we kind of know where we ought to try and get to. And that's the bit, because it's ingrained in us. I guess as kids, we grow up with this sense of justice and basics of right and wrong. And therefore, what you're doing is basically saying this, actually, don't worry, because there's some not good stuff happening. But actually, as you say, there's a positive hope there, which if we can identify the factors that are taking us off course, we can try and steer ourselves back to where we all know we intuitively want to be.
And that works both at an individual level and an organizational level. So individually, we know when we're off course, we feel the dissonance, we actually have physical manifestations in terms of illnesses. And I mean, there's an enormous amount of data on this. You literally get physically ill. It's actually related. Lying can be related to things as random as cancer and infertility. I mean, like really, it takes a toll on us physically. In all kinds of other ways, as well as the psychological dissonance. But as organizations, we also can align ourselves and understand how we can comport with who we want to be. And that means thinking about environments and how we put people under pressure. And that is the key to a lot of this discussion, because the big finding in the behavioral science is the good finding that people want to be ethical and that if you ask them in the abstract, they absolutely will know what to do and have a good ethical compass. And that means, 92% of people, I take out the 7 to 8% of the population that are hardcore cheaters. And then we probably have some other population on the far end of the spectrum. And, this is less well studied, but, 1 to 2% of the population, maybe 3% of the population, who are just going to do the right thing anyway. And they're the super rigid, impossible people to be related to, like, who these people are. But that means, given 7, 8%, and at the most, like 1, 2%, 3% on the other side, that means that that's together 10% of the population, which means that 90% of us are up for grabs, that 90% of us want to be doing the right thing, and that we can design systems to enable us to follow our best instincts and give us the behavior that we want to be exhibiting and that we want to, and how we want to live our lives. And that should be a great message for businesses. It should be a great message for people interested in ethics. And now let's talk about how you actually do that.
And I think that's really interesting because when you so I'll ignore the 2%, right? Because they're not something we would ever have to worry about. And possibly actually, because I think that's slightly strange. And there's other questions to be answered as to.
Yeah, no, you can have people who are just too rigid in an organization. And, and like I said, that's much less well studied, but we are talking about big landscape pictures, and that does mean that 90% is up for grabs. Plus you have that extra percent that if you harness their best instincts and you get them on board, they're going to be really 110% on board.
But what's interesting is and this sort of plays into Yuval Feldman's work around, the focus is always on the bad people. So we look at that and say, we don't want that. And we conflate this idea that 90%, they could be the 8%, right? They could become that. And so we're focusing. And what you're basically saying is, look, as you said, they're up for grabs, right? There is the possibility to get them because they understand the underlying piece. So this is a tremendous opportunity. And so if we look at that and say, if you were looking at sort of market share for selling something, you'd be like, 90% of the market.
This is a market I want to be in. Right, yes, right. This is how I want to run my company. And I will also make another point about how this is a really positive message. This is how you enable innovation. This is how you enable employee engagement. This is how you get the best out of your people. This is a competitive advantage. And companies that figure this out do so much better. They have, higher profits over longer term, more consistently. They borrow at lower rates. They have less turnover. They're able to harness their talent. And right now in a tight labor market, absolutely, you want people to stay. You want people to feel as though they can give them the best of their intellectual give you the best of their intellectual capital and get in there and really contribute to your organization. And if you're going to try and get that kind of engagement from people, you have to do the ethical things right. But even more fundamentally, I would say, and this is something I'm going to borrow from Linda Trevino, who's been in the field and just a legend for 40 years, that she says ethics is a garden and you need to tend it. You need to spend time and energy tending it. I would kind of flip that and also say ethics is a garden, which means something's going to grow there, whether you tend it or not.
I love that.
So if you don't pay attention to this stuff and you just keep adding pressures and you don't think about the ethical behavior which you may be triggering or the unethical behavior that you may be triggering, remember it's a garden, something's going to grow. You can get termites in the woodwork. Like you can get this problem where these issues tend to metastasize. They tend to migrate across companies. They tend to take the whole thing down. And then how are you sailing your ship when you have no idea what timber is about to fall apart? I mean, you look like Boeing, right? You have airplanes falling out of the sky because you have problems in your 737 MAX aircraft. Then you have problems in your lying to the FAA. Then you have problems in your Dreamliner. Then you have problems in this and that and the other thing. And that's exactly what it looked like at Wells Fargo, where it wasn't just, 3,500 fraudulent accounts. It was also robo-signing for mortgage foreclosures. It was, taking advantage of veterans. It was thing after thing after thing after thing. And that's what it looked like at Volkswagen, with the emissions cheating. It wasn't just one type of vehicle that was affected. It was across a whole range of vehicles. It was over 17 years of incubating inside the company. It was 10 years of engine redesigns. It was, teams hundreds of miles apart and through suppliers. And I mean, you get these huge things. The garden's been growing for a long time. Right? There's something there, and it makes a company unmanageable because all you are doing at that point is just doing damage control. You have no control of the ship. You have no control because you don't really understand what's happening, and all this stuff has been growing in the dark under pressure. And so it really is key. I would say, this is something that is core to management, is core to successful companies. It is also the termite in the woodwork that takes down companies that don't take it seriously. And
that's fascinating because I think when a lot of people approach it and sort of say, well, as long as we've got some core principles that we can run the business by, there's nothing I need to worry about too much, right? Because we're not. So obviously we wouldn't do these extreme things. So whatever your industry you're in, you'd find the sort of extreme things that we'd never be involved in that. But your point is actually, if you don't keep an eye on it, this thing, I mean, literally on an industrial scale, it becomes a widespread problem. And so the idea that you could, I guess if I took a sort of behavioral science framing of it and said, there's neutral choice architecture, On some level, you will be doing things that have an ethical component. You will be making implicit or explicit ethical decisions. And so you're engaged in this space, whether you want to be or not. And therefore you need to keep an eye on it. And so that's the challenge here, is that you can't sort of hide because our business model isn't unethical, or because we've put a principle in our values that says we're going to Google's a great example, right? Do no evil. Classic example of simple to say, slightly more complicated in reality. But you're basically saying, okay, whether you like it or not, business people, this is on your watch and it's going to happen. And so you need to pay attention to it.
Yeah. And it's either a competitive advantage or it's your company falling apart. So pay attention to it. And I'd also say, the behavioral scientists are really clear about this. If you have a CEO who just says, oh, I come in and I write the right things and I hire good people and I leave them alone, it's a disaster. Right? I mean, what have you done? You've abdicated all responsibility for the garden, right? The company is not your company anymore, and stuff will grow there that you have no idea about. And if you're not interested and you're not speaking this language and you're not finding out about it, you're going to get hijacked. You're going to find that you have no company to control, right? You have nothing. Your people are either actively lying to you, like at Volkswagen, where it was North Korea without labor camps, or you're laughing. It's true. That was a saying in Germany,
right.
Where you are. Yeah. So, you grow what you grow.
Right.
And it shouldn't be a surprise. And not only that, I'd put another twist on this and say the hypocrisy between putting something really lovely on the wall and not living it will drive even more people away. That's going to be even more toxic, because we are very socially attuned animals, and we watch for behavior and we watch for what actually happens. And if the behavior does not follow what is said, it can absolutely turn people off, and you get people leaving. You get your best talent out the door, left and right.
And one of the things I think is fascinating I'm not sure you were ever able fully to do this, but you definitely can't now, is this idea of what we say in public and what we do internally is somehow segregated. In other words, the image that historically you could see businesses that might have projected externally a very nice image and then internally unpleasant. And nowadays, those two things, because of technology and our ability to share information and people's, they have mechanisms to speak up about it. Actually, all of that stuff comes together. And so you can no longer get away with these sorts of things. Everything is up for grabs and transparent in a way that wasn't before.
But I think that sometimes it's in people's faces in a way that is particularly galling. So, the more extreme your position, the more the dissonance, right? So you have Johnson & Johnson, which has now, infamously put its code of ethics on stone tablets in its lobby, right? And that is the same company now that is trying to absolve itself of liability for the talcum powder cases by doing a bankruptcy filing in Texas. It's so obvious, and where you work and what the reaction of the company is. And it makes it either a company that you can manage or not manage. And you get honestly, you reap what you sow, in the sense of who's going to stay at that company. What are they going to be motivated by? If you're just paying them money, that's going to get really expensive really fast, and if you are instead offering people some sense of purpose, and this does link to the purpose discussions that are happening in business school, where they're finding that they really are trying to motivate people to get the best out of them by talking about a purpose, right? Management is the control of people and things for a purpose. You're trying to send people in the same direction in the same way, right? What is that purpose? What have you articulated to motivate people? And if that purpose will not move people because it's, what we want to do is declare bankruptcy on our talcum powder cancer cases, that's not going to get your best people. That's not going to, you're going to get people who are the people who stay are either the people who don't have options, or the people who decide that they're just going to take the money and, they make their peace with it, or frankly, the research shows that they don't make their peace with it. They live with it in cognitive dissonance for much of their lives. And that's just a really difficult place to be, where there are so many other choices. And, even through an economic lens, this is something that makes sense. Right? If you're going to harness the best of your company, if you're going to get the results that you want to get, you want airplanes that fly, to go back to the Boeing case. That would be good, right? You want to sell people more airplanes because the other ones are flying, right? That all would be good.
Right, but it's weird because there is no other investment that you would make, well, in equipment, for example, where you would do what we do in many cases with human capital, which is where we don't try and get the best out of it. And what you're talking about here, it's been an interesting journey for me because I came into this whole space talking about human risk, right? Which is basically everybody poses a risk. Every single person has the potential to do something we don't want or not do something we need them to do. And over time, I've sort of realized there's the opposite side, which I call human reward, being the risk reward, which is how do we get the best out of people? And those two things are interrelated because if you overcook the human risk thing, you don't get the max out of people. If you unleash people and don't think about the risks they pose, you get the opposite problem. And so this is the delicate balancing act where we need to nurture the human capital that we have to get the best, not the most, but the best out of it. Now, you wouldn't do that if you were buying a plant and equipment or a factory. You wouldn't kind of run it ragged. You'd say, how can I'd oil the machinery. Right?
Do the basics.
Right.
Get your ship to sail. I mean, get your engine to run. This is an insane way to think that you can manage a company. It's not, it's going to fall apart on you. And surprise, surprise, we see really high turnover rates. We see people asking for bigger and bigger salaries because they're trying to compensate lack of purpose and engagement with money. And you see them be less loyal. It's just a more and more difficult situation to manage. And it's more and more fragmentary when the purpose of management is to get them together and march in the same direction. You're countering the basic fundamentals of management.
Well, what's interesting is this is, this points to exactly why you're interested in solving this problem. But this is prevalent, right? You rattled off a list of companies, and I know there's a ton more in your mind.
Oh yeah,
there's this. We could keep going to the end of the show with you going and another one and another one.
There we go.
There's a ton of, and what I find interesting about it is it's not just a list of companies that we've heard of them all, right? So these aren't just little blocks. These are big issues. And this is happening on quite a big scale. So this problem that you're looking to address it's not like I could have created a narrative around banking saying, okay, well, there's something about that sector where it attracts some bad people, does some bad things, but that's that sector. And there's some dynamics. But this is cross-sector, right? If I look at the companies you've referred to, they operate, we've talked about manufacturing, we've talked about automotives, we've talked about financial services. And we could keep going and name people in a way. So this is quite widespread. And what I find interesting about it is the scale of the problem this is not some small thing. This is a major issue across and it's just happening in one country. I can look at Switzerland, I can look at Germany, I can look at the UK, I can look at Japan, I can look at, and so on and so forth. So this is really widespread across a range of things in a range of different environments and a range of different cultures.
Let's suggest it's human beings.
Right.
I mean, what is the common denominator all across that? That goes back to the beginning of the discussion. We talk about human beings and our ethical instincts and how we're wired as a species. And you either work with that and work with that properly, or you don't, with terrible consequences.
And so you've identified this challenge, right? It's clearly this
a little bit one.
Talk us through the idea of the book, because before we were recording, we were saying you've decided here to write something that is for practitioners. You'll love this. People in the real world, as opposed to academics, right? Who can take this and to try and address this problem.
Intelligent lay people with questions. I mean, we, in the before times, like when it was normal to walk through an airport and go to the bookstore, right? Before COVID and all the rest of it, right? The idea was that this would be in an airport bookstore. We priced it at $18.99 to make it super accessible, right? We want this to be in everyone's pocket. We want this to be, available to you as a go-to guide and resource. And it's written in short question and answer style. It's got really good science, really good data, really good, take this to the bank, take this literally to the meeting with your, boss where you're having this conversation. Like, we wanted to give people resources, actual things that they could do about the world, where they are, as they are in the situations that they're in.
And so talk to us a little bit about how you structure that, because we've talked to the issue, and you've got, okay, I want to give you a practical guide or answer some real. And this is real life practical questions, right? We're not answering sort of
super practical
hypothetical things that we all find very easy. Would you kill someone? No, is generally the answer, right? But that's really easy to say in that abstract. So you're not in that space. It's very much around, this is real life stuff that you're going to find. How did you even start to think about getting a handle on it and guiding people through this?
Well, I want to call out Lynn Stout, who was my mentor and a huge force for the book. She died in 2018. She was actually my corporations professor at Harvard and kept in touch with me for 20 years. And this is a flagship series for the Oxford University Press. And when they approached her with the idea of getting something into people's hands, she was immediately intrigued and said she would only do it with me, which I'm deeply grateful for. And so she wrote the first chapter, which nobody's changing, by the way. I don't want any feedback on the first chapter. That's just Lynn's voice. Right. That's happening. But she was an amazingly gifted scholar and speaker and everything else. So the first chapter is just incredible. Yeah, and then we worked together on the questions, and the whole book is a series of short questions and answers. So that really was the content of the book. Now, obviously, I had to change it after she passed to add some things, but I didn't take things away. I just added, extra areas as we saw the book itself developing, and I was really trying to be faithful to bringing this to people. And so the question was, once Lynn passed in 2018, would I continue the book? And the answer is, of course. Oh my goodness. How could I not? This is a labor of love. This has got to be there. This is, it was really Lynn's vision to say it, but her voice has got to be carried on. And this project has got to happen. And it's, actually, I have to say one more thing. This is the kind of person Lynn was. When she knew that she was going to pass, we had to tell Oxford because, and Lynn wrote, "It is my dying wish that my co-author be listed as first author." And it was the press's response to say that would be the ethical thing to do. Like, this is really a important book that so many people gave so much to. So, so that was the vision. That's what it was about. And we spent an enormous amount of time together thinking about what are the big questions. I mean, when can you lie? When can you stay silent? How does this work? The really practical nuts and bolts kinds of questions. And there are resources for answers to these questions. And we can point you to those resources and give you that information. And that's what we wanted to do.
And do you want to give us just pick a sort of an example of just sort of how? So what's something that someone might come and look at that they can remember? How would that work? Just what sort of best encapsulates that, so people get a sense of what they would be finding.
Well, so thinking about the structure of the book is in chapters, and each chapter is organized around major thematic questions. So I think of the book as kind of in 4 chunks. So the first chunk, the first basket, or whatever you want to call it, is really thinking about an overview of business ethics, the benefits of acting ethically. Why should I do this, right? I mean, when we're talking practical questions, we are talking really practical questions.
That should be so. I think that's really important, right? Because when you're dealing with something that is sort of, well, of course we're ethical, right? Obviously we're ethical. Tackling that and answering those questions, I think, is kind of a key component. And I was glad that you did that, because it would be very, very easy to have missed that step and just go, well, we'll just take it for granted that that's obvious.
No, it's not obvious. Not obvious at all in this cost-benefit analysis world where, people don't always factor into the equation. And you really have to, because you're dealing with people at all times and your company exists in the world. News to everyone, right? I mean, like I said, it's a super practical book. And then when we wanted to do something that was really important to us, which was to cover, there are lots of good books out there, but we hadn't seen any other book, and I don't know of any other book.
There's some terrible books out there as well, by the way. But anyway.
Okay. Yes, absolutely. I will grant that, but I'm trying to be. I'm always looking for the silver lining, right? I'm looking for the awful part. And there are really good books. There are people who have spent serious thought and effort on this, and I want to be respectful of that. But most of the books in this area tend to come from a certain disciplinary perspective. So there are books on economics that teach it as prisoner's dilemma. There are books on, psychology that teach it as blind spots. There are moral philosophers who harken back to thousands of years of religious tradition and moral philosophy, and these other pieces that tend to think in terms of puzzles. if you have here are these ethical issues that are on the line, and let's go through them in different frameworks. And then there are lawyers who tend to think of ethics in terms of compliance, which I think of as the very floor, right? Please don't do things that are illegal. Okay, now we can actually have pro-social behavior above that, right? And if you want to run your company and you want to run a successful company, let's really talk about that, right? So we wanted to cover all these different lenses because there's truth in everything. And we hadn't seen those pieces incorporated together before. So we have a chapter on the moral philosophical basis for business ethics. And we want to talk about the science because there's an enormous amount of science here. So we have, what does science tell us about ethical behavior? That's chapter 4. And then there's a big chunk that we felt that was missing from a lot of discussions about business ethics. And I fully blame my own profession as a lawyer. Where we have been billing by the hour. And so nobody wants to come talk to us and just sit down and say, when I'm in a contract, because it could cost you $2,000 an hour to, have that discussion. And then there are a lot of times in which, just frankly, people seek out lawyers when they're already in trouble and they're being indicted or something's happening, right? Like, it tends to be the very end of the process. And that's a real problem for all kinds of reasons, because people are working largely for corporations, but other business entities. And they need to understand what it means to work for a legal entity. Can I be given an unethical order? What does that mean? What are my responsibilities? What are the business's responsibilities? How does that whole system work? And so we really wanted to talk about what the legal foundations were for business ethics, because it's there. There are all these ideas of fiduciary duties. And what does that mean? And it's fascinating to me. I teach in business school, and I teach at Harvard Business School. And I will talk to many, many people who have spent a lot of time in business and they've never heard of a fiduciary duty. I'm like, this is what's running your life. This is what, this is the background of a lot of your employment situation, or even now in the new world, where it's not necessarily employment, it can be a gig work kind of situation, whatever. This is what is behind, you're working for someone else. So let's have those conversations. So we have that conversation in chapter 5, the legal foundations of business ethics. We talk about chapter 6, understanding corporations, LLCs, and other legal persons. What does it mean for a corporation to be a legal person? You and I are natural people, but what is this thing that cannot walk, talk, breathe, sign contracts without natural people? How does that make sense as a legal person? And then chapter 7, thinking about the corporation as an ethical person in modern society, really talking about what are the expectations, because there is a legal framework for, say, corporate social responsibility, for ESG initiatives, for all these other things. So we need to have that discussion. What are the expectations? How does this work? And then there's another, so that's the second bucket. The third bucket would really be about the costs of acting unethically, major traps in modern business, special issues of ethics and leadership and negotiations, specific liability questions, whistleblowing. I mean, a lot of the mechanics of how things work. When we're thinking about business ethics, what are the most common violations in business ethics? What does this look like? What is this landscape? How do the mechanics work? What happens here? We have a lot of information about that so that you can see it and identify it and do something about it. And then the last bucket was really about instituting best practices, designing an ethical culture, and how to respond to investigations and protect your reputation. And in that last bucket, I would also put the appendix, because this is a surprisingly important piece of the book. It was something that Lynn really wanted to be in there. And it was a list of resources that people could actually reach out to. Not resources that will be predatory, not resources that have an angle necessarily to take your money, but resources if you really are in some situation, who can you reach out to? What can you do? And so that's a place to get started.
Wow. And I loved it because you were answering questions that once you pointed out they was a good thing to think about, I sort of went, oh yeah, that is really interesting. I'd never thought about that. And the fiduciary duty would be a really good example from my perspective, because I know what it means, and I come at it from a sort of banking context and think about what does it mean in that context. So I'm familiar with what it might mean in a bit, but you kind of set me around and thinking, oh, okay. And I loved it because as I was going through, it seemed to me that this was a really good illustration that these are issues that have been thought about before, right? This isn't ethics is not a 21st century problem, right? This has been grappled with. Well,
we're human beings.
Right, yeah, exactly.
And we've had to supervise people working for us and be supervised by them before.
So
yes.
you wouldn't, but if you, for lawyers, forgive me, but for non-lawyers, you'd look at it and sort of think, well, if I pointedly, I can create a narrative that lawyers, awful money grabbing people who are there to sort of hammer me, and it gets, anytime a lawyer's involved, it's unpleasant, right? It's not
right. We're the land of no.
Right.
Compliance
So,
is the problem.
Yeah.
There's the
And
brakes on everything. There's the whip blankets.
I don't want any of that stuff. So the fact is, so there's a little bit of me with my slightly cynical, slightly tongue-in-cheek, non-legal mind says, it's really interesting. They have actually got involved in this stuff. Right?
They did design the legal system that sets the defaults and the rules here.
But the bit that's interesting
what are those?
Right? But I think there is a 21st century cynicism around it, right? Because getting lawyered up is not a generally a good thing. Like something's gone over.
No, it means that the whole process has failed, right? Something has gone terribly wrong because you didn't have basic information to know how to navigate the system in the first place. And so we're very careful. We say right at the front of the book, we are not your lawyers. We are not providing legal counsel. Go check with your own lawyers, like all the rest of the disclaimers.
Disclaiming all responsibility.
Disclaiming up the wazoo, which we have to, I mean, because I don't want somebody to, take this and
right, because people reading this have real issues they're trying to solve.
Yeah, I mean, like, look, I did I mention the book is $18.99? We're not making a fortune off of this. There's nothing to sue here. No, this is a public service.
Right.
But the information is good. The information is vetted. It is stuff that you could really take and use. And so it's sort of, here's the way I explain it in a corporate law class. There are so many different defaults that have been set up around you. It's a little bit like having been a passenger in a car your whole life. And you've noticed that people stop at red lights, and you notice that people go at green lights, and you notice that there are these yield signs and stop signs and all the rest of it. But nobody has actually explained the rules of the road to you. So you just have this kind of intuitive sense of, yeah, this is how the traffic flows. It's time to talk about traffic rules. Like, it's time to talk about this system is designed, right? There's not an accident everybody's stopping at red lights. Like, there's a reason. Let's talk about that and give you that information so that you can make your own best decisions and hopefully drive your own car, or drive or at least have some sense of agency in this system.
I'm smiling because my late grandfather had never passed his driving test, right? And he spent his whole time critiquing my grandmother's driving. And it was all experience from sitting in the passenger seat.
From sitting in the passenger seat where you absorb all this stuff secondhand. But maybe you got something a little wrong. Maybe you got something let's talk about it, because you may presume that you understand what the defaults are, but let's really have that conversation. And then the system that you're working under and working within. And so, again, I see that as an empowering message. I see that as something that we can give people so that they can make better decisions. And another big message for business people in this is, don't be scared by lawyers. This whole lawyering up, I have to go talk to legal counsel, that, the lawyer says no, so I can't. Stop making the lawyers the scapegoats. Honestly, the law gives you so much ability to run your company with tremendous discretion, as long as you understand what the rules of the road are and the basic fiduciary duties. So I was a defense attorney for a while, and 80% of the caseload is really just 5-6 things, people walking in the door, the same issues again and again and again. And what drew me to teaching was this impulse to say, hello, if you knew about these 5 or 6 issues, which are really the basis of, frankly, most lawyers' business plans for the year, you would make different decisions, or at least you would talk to a lawyer earlier. You would get in this area and some red flag would go up, and you would have that conversation, and it would cost you at most a couple $100 or something like that to get it right, to get a contract drafted, to, navigate this the best way you can. And by the way, tip about using lawyers, don't walk in and say, draft this that says this to me. Go in and say, I would like to get there. How do I strategically, smartly get there, right? Use the expertise, right? You'd be amazed. And then you're done. You don't have the huge litigation afterwards, and you don't have the indictment coming down, and you don't have, wear your seatbelt. It's the same idea, right? Get it done right the first time.
But I think that's fascinating, because I see in lots of cases, and I think this doesn't help it, in a kind of, I want to do something at work, and we have to run this past legal. And it's given us sort of power that you wouldn't give to, I don't know, health and safety, right? Because you would have enough knowledge about health and safety to go, okay, this idea of, I don't know, electrifying all the metal in the building. Like, I'm not an expert electrician. That does not seem like a good idea. I don't need to check with those people. I've got a basic understanding of how electricity works. And so I don't have that kind of approval process. And I've seen lots of times where it's kind of like, well, before we need to clear this with legal. And I'm not saying that you should, but it seems to have this kind of, it's almost like a vision of a gladiator, thumbs up, thumbs down from the legal function, where it feels like it's a separate piece and therefore it becomes this big deal. And I think, to your point, I think that's a really interesting angle you're talking about. It's sort of saying, let's just kind of equip ourselves with enough basic knowledge to be able to navigate the simple stuff. And sure, we should absolutely go talk to them, but that base level standing that's not the case when you look at some of the other things that one might have to deal with the work, like, for example, health and safety, where we can kind of, we can navigate that enough because we've got enough understanding of it. And I think that's a really interesting perspective that'll demystify some of these things and allow people to have it's how to use your legal function or your external laws much more intelligently.
Yes, exactly. Use your legal expertise to help you, right? And I'd also say it's so important because, lawyers are put in this impossible situation often, especially in-house counsel, where if people don't come to talk to them early enough, they can't help. Right? All they can do at that point is just sort of bail you out of jail, and that's the best, right? Like, you tie their hands if you don't get them involved. But also there's this issue of, I'm afraid of talking to the legal department because they're going to tell me no. And that's part of this issue of people coming into the legal department saying, I want to do X, draft me this contract that says X. And the legal department has to say, well, that's not the way contracts work. Like, back you up, have this whole conversation. So what the business person hears is no. But really what the lawyer's trying to do is say, look, tell me what your goals are. Let me add value. Let me walk this path with you. And if the idea is you're really worried about your transfer of intellectual property to Brazil or whatever it is, like, tell me what the business issue is and let me help you get there. Because you may be dealing with antitrust issues, you may be in import-export control issues, you may be copyright issues, you could be by insisting that this is what this thing says, and the only way that this could happen is by you're not using the expertise that's at your fingertips and could make you so much more sophisticated. So I would say this is actually a plea to say, look, learn something about it because it's a part of your business. You need to be able to manage every piece of your business. You wouldn't not know something about accounting, not know something about marketing, not know something about your technology operations. Like, that would be unconscionable, right? That would be, malpractice.
Right? But
there's this idea that somehow we don't have to do that with the law that governs the very liability of our company and the existence of our company. Like, that's bizarre. So, get involved, like, own this. And that's my big takeaway message with ethics. Own it, right? It's yours. It's everyone's. It's not to be, legal doesn't own it. Risk and compliance doesn't own it. Like, everybody owns it, and they need to know something about it so that they can act intelligently for themselves, for the company, to make best decisions, to get you where you want to go.
And the thing I thought was fascinating about the book, because I thought it's a great read that just as a sort of like, here's some stuff I need to think about and some principles, and it's very clear to me that you've come at this and the experience that you've had with your students and thinking about the sorts of topics you talk about, how to prime them for future business existence kind of came through. And so I was reading it thinking there were, a few times where I just went, oh, I hadn't really thought about that. Actually, that's an interesting dynamic. And so it was almost a lovely way of prepping me for, because often ethical issues can sometimes arrive and they don't neatly come with a big arrow pointing ethics alert, right? This is a big issue, right? Because I don't know, if somebody's trying to bribe you, they're not going to be going. Right?
I can be like, is $400 enough?
Yeah, right. So I thought, let me bribe you, right? It doesn't play out.
Let me speak into the microphone a little more and make sure that it's on tape for the FBI, whoever else is listening.
Yeah. Yes. Right. So I thought it was interesting. So it was simultaneously that early warning thing where here's some stuff where, because this doesn't come neatly packaged, right? You need to be alert to it in a way, because it would be very easy. And I know people use this as an excuse. It's very easy to find yourself in unethical waters because you haven't really thought about that there's an ethical component. And then, to your point, you get in deeper and deeper until you realize, and then your way out is, well, you're up to your neck in it anyway. So, So I thought it was interesting in that perspective. And then the second bit was genuinely as a kind of like, oh God, something has just happened. Right? How do I, like, almost like a sort of emergency fire instructions? And I thought it was great that it could be read both of those two ways. So ideally, to your point, right, let's not get ourselves in that position. So let's think about dynamics and situations where we might have a challenge. And therefore, actually, the likelihood of us needing to read it in an emergency situation is significantly reduced, because we know that that's the kind of scenario we ought to be thinking around that we might not have considered before. And yeah, if we did ever find ourselves, it's helpful for that. So I thought it was nice it covered both of those pieces. I felt like it would sit on my bookshelf, one as a regular reminder of pressure, but secondly, if I really did get into trouble and I could, there's something I can turn to without having to embarrass myself. And I think that embarrassment fact is interesting, because a lot of, particularly if we're being conned or dragged into something by other people, right, there's an embarrassment factor that's there. So I love the fact that it served both of those purposes.
Great. Good. We did what we wanted to do. Absolutely. No, I mean, Christian, we wanted to get this out to people. We wanted to have it in people's hands. We wanted to give them all these pieces of it. And I hope that they make better decisions because of it. I mean, I hope they read it proactively, but I hope it's also there when, stuff hits the fan, which it will.
Well, that's an interesting point, isn't it? Because that idea of it will happen, I think is fascinating. When we think about particularly some of the, I don't ever want to consider that I'm unethical. And even some of the most wildly unethical people on the planet know that they shouldn't say that they're unethical, right? They know that they need to claim that they're not. They need to find a way of kind of, not presenting themselves that, because that's not good for your self-image. And so they understand that particular piece. But it's interesting that these things are, that we as we look at the world, the dynamic here is that fundamental thing we started with, that we know intuitively that we shouldn't be doing this stuff. We can find ourselves in that particular situation. And so this is complicated in a way that many other. If I took, I don't know, something like a fire, we all intuitively, we can see it. It's hot. It's there. There's smoke. There's warning signals all around it. And we sort of have a sense of what we should do in that situation. Ethics doesn't come like that, not neatly packaged. But yet we feel we ought to be able to deal with it. And so that embarrassment factor is quite significant, isn't it? Which is that's why we find it difficult to get help. Whereas I think things that are more obvious, either we have the wherewithal to deal with it, a fire being a good example, or there's no shame in calling the fire brigade.
Right.
But there is a little bit with ethical issues, because we kind of know that we ought to know better.
Yeah, and there's really a couple pieces to that. One is that, like you say, we don't want to believe these things about ourselves, right? There's all this cognitive dissonance, and we talked about the health problems, and we talked about we're brilliant at rationalizing, right? We're really way too good at rationalizing our behavior when we don't want to see what it is that is right in front of us. And so labeling things that are ethical issues as ethical issues that does change decisions. And also it makes people uncomfortable sometimes. So there's a whole good, I really want to mention this for your listeners, giving voice to values. If they don't know about it, it's Mary Gentile's system. I colloquially talk about it as how to speak truth to power without getting fired. But it really is important, right? We want you to survive these things. And guess what? Ethical conflicts are going to happen all the time. This is not, you can't just run and hide. We talked about, this is a garden, it's going to grow. This is going to happen. This is life. So you need to know how to have these conversations and handle these conversations. So definitely sending people to that. And there's a free version with just little snippets called Ethics Unwrapped. It's part of Robert Prentice's group at the University of Texas at Austin. McComb School of Business has this great website. So I'm sending people to that.
Links to all of those things in the show notes.
Good. Want to make sure, like I said, this is this is about giving people resources and things to turn to. So there's this issue of we don't want to believe it and we don't want to see it. But also we tend to, in order to just reconcile our own identities, we tend to believe that we're more ethical than we are. So even when something is pointed out to us, we tend to rate ourselves far more highly than we should. This is sort of like the phenomenon where, 90% of us believe that we're the top 10% of drivers.
Right.
You just that cannot statistically be true, but but you do ask people how good they are at driving, and the vast majority of people will tell you they're way better than average, right? oh, we're great drivers. It's your grandfather in the front seat of the car going, oh yeah, I never got my driver's license.
He would have been amazing. He would have been incredible.
Else is driving.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. No, this is it. And you might say this is I don't know. Like we do see the world this way. So it's really important to have these conversations where we say, you know what? Yes, nobody's threatening your self-image and your identity and your all the rest of this, but let's ask some questions and frame them as ethical questions and see if we're quite as comfortable with this as we thought we were before. So then it's also another very good reason for having these conversations and taking things apart. And then the last part of this is really, once we're in a pickle, sometimes because of the pressures around how we got there, either peer pressure, this is a business necessity, this is, the way we do things, this is how, what everybody else is doing, I need to do this to compete, to survive, to pay my mortgage, whatever it is, fill it in, right? We tend to also then discount what it is that we've actually done until it gets really uncomfortable. And by the time it's that uncomfortable and you don't want to tell your grandma, or you don't want to see it on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, or the New York Times, or Financial Times, or whatever it is, right? That means that you're already having a disgust response to yourself. And by the time you have a disgust response to yourself, that is just toxic. So, you've gone pretty far down the path by the time people start to realize that they're really unhappy with life. And so I would say for people who are all the way to that path, at least put down the shovel and stop digging. Like, at least have the conversation about, okay, what do I do now? And maybe you have the power to turn things around. Maybe there's a way out. Maybe, but at least stop digging. At least have that moment where you say, I am not happy where I am. Now, what do I do about it? And if that's the moment that you find the book, fantastic, right? Like, at least you found it there. That's good.
The shame factor and the embarrassment and the sort of, the lengths that people go to try and get themselves out of trouble. With my background in banking, I've always found it fascinating where you look at someone, a rogue trading, for example. Most of them don't set out to go, how can I make as much money out of the organization as possible? It becomes, there's always this narrative of they were trying to inflate their bonus. And on some level, that's psychologically true. But generally, it's I got myself into trouble. I didn't know how to get out. And then what I find amazing is the creativity of the human brain when it comes to getting ourselves out of trouble, by which I mean both the stories we tell ourselves, but also the mechanisms that we try and use to convince others we're very, very adept at trying to find ways out of that problem, which demonstrates to me, and it's people that you wouldn't even expect who find incredibly creative ways to solve the problem. Which, if they could deploy that creativity in other contexts,
amazing. Look, there's a great legal business opportunity somewhere in there.
Yeah. But it's amazing. It really shows how strong this stuff is. Yes. That people go to extraordinary lengths for, and obviously as it snowballs, it can get bigger and bigger. But even for small things, the ability to tell what quote unquote white lies we're good at that stuff as a species, which I find really interesting.
Yeah, we're disturbingly good at it because above all, we need to rationalize our own identity. Every defense lawyer, criminal defense lawyer will tell you about these terrible sessions they'll have with defendants where they have to sit a defendant down and say, look, you should probably take the plea, right? You did this, you did this, you did this. The government can prove it. You should probably take the plea.
The fact pattern is not good.
The fact pattern is there. They have you on the wire, whatever it is. They have you dead to rights. They've got the bank accounts, whatever it is. And the defendants have the same reaction, which is fascinating, which is, I did this and this and this, but I'm not a criminal. And sort of like, but you did this and this but I'm not a criminal, right? It's not, they did those things, but they don't understand that becomes their new identity, right? We are what we do, right? And that is just really, really difficult for people. But it does say you need to be aware of your choices and be making the choices that you want to be making because you become that, right? And that's really hard to only discover at the end of the line.
Right. And I guess there's always this trend of things get worse, right? So we start small and we get bigger. And whether that's a rogue trading thing or telling lies or any of these things, there is that snowball effect that seems to kick in and that we can't constrain our, it's not like sort of, I'll do a little bit of unethical stuff, right? But I'll stop there. it's the equivalent of, do you want another drink, right? And we've all seen that kind of situation in a bar. Well, let's just have one more drink, and we know how that plays out. And I see it in a similar way that we kind of, at least in the bar situation, we kind of know, and it's kind of fun, and we'll stick around. But it's that similar sort of mindset. And so it struck me that when you talk about the untended garden that's going to go crazy and dry, we can see that on an individual level, which is, if I don't stop this thing now, I have the potential, not guaranteed, but I have the potential it's going to get out of control and get crazy.
And we can actually see that in the behavioral research. I mean, there's this fascinating set of studies where they've, so your amygdala, your fear center of your brain, lights up the first time you transgress. And then if you don't get feedback from that, if nobody takes you aside at the water cooler and says, that's not who we are, that's not how we do things, go back and change the report or whatever it is, right? And you don't get that feedback, then you do it again, and your fear center doesn't light up, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And this is how we get the ethical slide. We get the snowballing. We literally do not have the same checks on our behavior anymore. And that's how this stuff metastasizes and gets really, really big, surprisingly fast.
Right. Yeah. And I think there's the fascinating bit about it tends not to be, I jump from 0 to 100. It is that step by step piece, which, to your point, means that we ought to, on some level, be able to catch stuff.
Catch ourselves, right?
Right.
I mean, is there a moment where that alarm went off and then it was silenced and we talked ourselves out of it, and then we did something bigger and then we didn't? There's a whole, you've been down this path, right? You've been walking in this garden for a while. It's happening. It's growing around you. This is what's changing. And it's fascinating how people change over time in environments and situations. You can literally, you work someplace where the ethical misconduct is really bad, and you no longer have the moral compass you did when you walked in there. You become part of that environment. You literally start to change how you speak to people. This is great research on this, right? That campaign contributions start to change. Your personal campaign contributions start to change within 6 months of going inside another organization if their political leanings are different than yours. Like, you literally start to use different language. You literally become a different person. And the question has to be, do you want to be that person? Is that, where's the check? Where's the check to say, I am making conscious decisions about these things?
Hearing you talk about this, there's a real clarity there, and it makes perfect sense in the abstract. So, I'd say, okay, that in the same way that I know that if you talk to me in the abstract, I would say, well, I would never do those things.
Right.
And you've brought, there's a real clarity in both what you say and in the way you write about these things that sort of says, and it's lovely because it's an easy, you're not lecturing people from a sort of hellfire and damnation perspective.
Oh,
it's
no.
like, let's
this is all of us.
Right. Yeah. And so I look at that and I sort of think and I'm fascinated by how you think about those things, because you've spent a lot of time looking at this issue. And don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to list your moments of ethical lapses. But I wondered how you thought about how does looking with the degree of clarity that you bring to the subject, how does that make you think about it in your personal life? And I'm not suggesting it makes you saintly or perfect, right? That's not where I'm going with this, but I'm just intrigued as to sort of, do you still find it really difficult? Are we in the same space that when Kahneman and co talk about biases, right, you have the same chat? Does that clarity help? Is spending more time looking at this making it easier for you, or are you spotting more? How does that impact you as someone that's spent a lot of time thinking about this?
I have a lot of empathy for people. I really do. I wrote this because I care and because I've seen people be really tortured by this stuff. I mean, it's, somebody asked me once, what's the worst ethical lapse that I sort of have to deal with? And I'm like, it's the person who goes to the end of that line and suddenly realizes who they are. Like that's a tragedy for me, because that person had all those moments to think about it, to change things. And if you become what you do, then you really have to wonder about that, right? Like that is a process that happens over time, but eventually you are what you are. And that can be terrible if you don't like it. That can be just horrible if you don't like it. So, I think at every point, I just want people to, like, I really want this to be an empowering message in the sense of make your choices, understand what those choices mean, and make the choices that are the right choices for you. Make the choices that make sure that you can look at yourself in the mirror, that you're not, divorced 4 times with a substance abuse problem and don't talk to your kids. And, like, there's some,
Right.
on whatever, version of pacemaker is the, last thing that the doctor said he could put in, or she could put in. Like, there are these moments where it's just taken this terrible toll on human beings. And, if we can have conversations and we can work in environments by making those environments that we want to be in, that life could be so different. Those are people with so many talents and so many things to give who, they need a path. They need a path, and they and being able to have those ethical conversations. Somebody once asked me, do all your students at Harvard Business School take your class and immediately quit the school? And I was like, no, hopefully not. That would be a disaster on every level, because I want those people to stay in business. I want, the most ethical people need to be in business. They need to do well in business. They need to be leading companies, running companies, have every one of these competitive advantages. And it gets back to that, which is, knowing this is hopefully empowering, and it lets you live the life that you want to live and run the companies that you want to run and build the things you want to build and have the impact in the world that you want to, without wondering why your ship is falling apart and the termites are in the woodwork and, you're having another heart attack. Like,
Right,
let's have that conversation.
There's something really interesting in just reflecting what you were saying, which is we often, if we think about whistleblowing as the ultimate sort of calling out of this stuff, which puts tremendous pressure on the person doing it. And I'd always thought about whistleblowing as a pro-social thing, in the sense of it's the right answer for the tribe as a whole, for society. But there was something in what you were saying there. Actually, it is also, if your whistleblowing involves calling an individual or group of individuals out, which inevitably it does, because as we know, there'll be a human component to the thing that you're whistleblowing on. There's an interesting bit that says you are actually doing them a favor in the long run. And so what I had always perceived to being a sort of broader support, they won't thank you for it in the moment, but there is an interesting narrative here that sort of says that there is the possibility they might one day see that as being a positive thing. And so I'd almost thought, well, I don't care what that person thinks. I know it's the right thing to speak out. But actually, there's a nice narrative here of you are actually helping them as well.
Well, and so this is fascinating, because how an organization reacts to whistleblowers tells you so much about the organization. You can be Credit Suisse and try to track down your whistleblowers and spy on them, right? Christian knows something about that.
The story, I should add, not tracking down whistleblowers.
Yeah. Anyway, which is to react as negatively as possible and try to retaliate and all the rest of it. Or you can be like some other companies. There's a famous story of another company, and I won't give the name because I learned about this under circumstances in which I can't give the name, but I would certainly give the behavior, because I think it's really neat. Where they would they had a big training session at the beginning for all of their recruits to explain their culture and explain how things work at the company and all the rest of it. And they had these top level executives come in and tell their personal story one after another, and laud these people as good examples. And it wasn't until the very end of the training that they revealed that every single one of those people had blown the whistle early in their career and were now at the top of the company.
Wow.
Fascinating. What kind of message do you think that sends? That sends, we're listening, we're hearing you, we're doing something about it, and we will protect you within the organization. And this company also had a tracking system to make sure that those whistleblowers' careers would advance at a regular pace, and would flag them and make sure that they got forward. Because if somebody is blowing the whistle, you have somebody who is overwhelmingly being motivated by the right ethical reasons. So 92% of whistleblowers actually report internally first, even if it's legally disadvantageous for them, right? Like, they are not doing this for the money, the vast majority of them. And so you have people who really do care. These are people who are engaged. These are people who want to see the best for the company. They believe in the company. They believe in the company's mission. That's who should be promoted. That's who should be harnessed. That's who should be at every level of the company. And if the company sends that message,
Right, because they've literally put their careers on the line. Right.
right.
Yeah. Wow. That is an amazing, wow. Fascinating, right? Really, really interesting. And as you say, lots of companies talk about it. Well, we want people to whistle, blah, blah, blah. But what are we judging? We're judging the actual behavior. So that's amazing. Fascinating stuff. Wow. Well, I hope that becomes more of a prevalent thing, because I think that is literally walking the talk.
Yeah. That company doesn't have as many problems. I mean, like, it's a really different kind of way of thinking about it. And those whistleblowers are actually incredibly valuable to the company. I mean, they're your canaries in the coal mine who are brave enough to tell you what's really going on. And as we talked about, companies are unmanageable. If you do not know what is going on, you don't understand the ethical problems within your company, people are terrified to talk to you, they're afraid of retaliation, you're not going to know. And it's going to be falling apart all around you. And in a way, you can also think about that poor behavior as stealing from the company. I mean, they're suppressing talent. Bullying suppresses talent left and right. There's some estimates that it can be up to 6% of profits per bully. I mean, it's a huge, huge, drain of talent, as does, by the way, sexual misconduct and harassment. I mean, you're not getting your stars of the future. You're getting people driving, abusing the authority that they're being given to, humiliate other people and drive them out. Other forms of misconduct. These things tend to cluster, and we talk about illegal behavior and compliance problems, but they tend to be together when you're telling people, look, anything goes and it's a jungle. Of course, you've told them it's a jungle. That's the ethics garden that you've grown. So what kind of behavior you're going to get? Surprise, surprise. And who's going to stick around? The people who get something personally out of that. It's not going to be pretty.
Wow. Amazing. Before I let you go, because I want you to keep doing more amazing research like you have been doing. Remind us what the book is called and where people can get hold of it.
All right. It's called Business Ethics, What Everyone Needs to Know. It's, like I said, very reasonably priced with the Oxford University Press, available wherever books are sold. And can I give the website too?
Yeah. Give us much detail as you want.
jsnelson.net. So jsnelson.net is the website. There's lots more about the book there, and you can buy it there or through any other bookstore.
Amazing. Links to all of those things in the show notes. And it goes without saying, and this is so obvious from the way you talk about this subject, right? The book is an amazing read. Incredibly useful. I'm going to have to reread it a few times. Not because I hasten to add, not because right now I am contemplating which of those unethical boxes you put in I'm ticking, but genuinely because it gave me food for thought. And I think there's something really, really interesting about tackling a subject that if you didn't go through the discipline of reading the book and having somebody to guide you through it, this is not one you can self-teach, right? Ethics is not something where you can just sit there and go, I sat in a room and thought about my behavior. I always thought it was slightly weird, right? Slightly distracted. But parents go and sit in your room and think about what you've done, right? Is the worst possible answer.
You're already planning the escape and who you're going to tell. Yeah, no, but it's so fascinating that kids are, you do have kids who come out of that and say, okay, yeah, I stole the cookie from the cookie jar. The kids are surprisingly ethical, surprisingly interested in fairness, surprisingly interested in these other things. And then somehow we need to bring that back out of us so that we enjoy being in our work families again. Let's put it that way.
Amazing. Josephine, please keep up the good work. I love your stuff, as you know. And thank you so much for being another amazing guest on the podcast.
Oh, my great honor. Thank you so much, Christian. All right. Take care of yourself.
So that's it for this special episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Josephine for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about Josephine's work and her book, Business Ethics, What Everyone Needs to Know, have a look in the show notes. There are links to those there. You'll also find links to some of the other topics that we referred to in our discussion. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, thank you. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. To be notified whenever a new episode of the show is released, do subscribe to the Human Risk Podcast newsletter. There's a link to that in the show notes. I'll be back with the regular schedule of this show very soon. But in the meantime, stay safe, remember to think ethically, and thank you so much for listening.